We're going to start by thinking about this past year. When we were in this room, emotions were absolutely raw. The stories were new, but the stories' subjects were very old. Harassment and discrimination and incivility were long-standing, and finally they bubbled to the surface. And maybe we're angry at a different level right now, but we're nonetheless committed. We want to find out what's been going on. And so, let's start by asking the people on our conversation team to tell us a little bit. By the way, I'm going to introduce them as they come up, and this empty chair is not for anyone we lost. It's for Sarah Glover, who is the president of NABJ, who's going to be joining us in progress. But let us start, and I'm going to start with Carrie, because I have a quote from you from last year. I want to make sure I get the quote right. Carrie Budoff Brown, the editor of Politico, said, "I will not hire assholes. And if you are a bully, you won't survive here. Nobody wants to be around bullies." Right? Or that other word. Carrie, what have you done in the past year?
Well, that quote, even though it's something I've said often, but I probably didn't say it publicly that way, it was interesting because it got people talking in my newsroom, both about saying that, but then also the fact that no news organization, no organization is free of assholes. And the bigger challenge is how we confront people in the newsroom who don't live up to the values that I certainly hold extraordinarily dear and believe is the engine of a good workplace, a good newsroom, a strong newsroom, and that is collaboration, support, respect. And it's certainly true that I am very, very clear when I'm hiring that I am put a lot of emphasis on how, not only whether the person is talented, is a strong journalist, but equally, how do they deal with conflict? How do they fold into teams? Do they truly understand and embrace the fact that I need you to be collaborative and supportive and respectful? And there have been, over the last year, intentional decisions that have been made to make sure that every team in my newsroom, to the best of my ability, can reflect that. Now, not all teams certainly live up to that every day, but as I created a politics team, a campaign team to cover 2020, at top of mind is, am I putting together a team of people who will support one another, be civil, and if you don't live up to that, then you literally will not and did not get a place on the campaign team that I put together. And that's because after 2 years of being in this job, I've seen it. It's like a little laboratory in a newsroom to see teams that are high performing versus teams that aren't high performing. And I do believe that teams that are that have a supportive, collaborative vibe, without a doubt, perform better and so therefore, as I create any team moving forward, I put nearly as much emphasis on, are you a talented journalist, as are you not an asshole, and will you not be an asshole to your colleagues? And if you are an asshole to your colleagues, you almost to a person hear from me or someone pretty high up. And we don't get it right every time, we don't reach everybody, but it's something that at any big gathering we have at the newsroom, or of the company, we have a town hall, big meeting once or twice a year, and my remarks always include the value and importance I place on that. And that's just because that reflects me, but it also, I believe it's important just for Politico, which is 12 years old, started as very much a tech startup and still has had work to do to sort of weed out that reputation as a place where, certain things were valued over others.
What certain things were valued over others?
I think I might have said last year, Politico's, a tech startup in all the ways that you would, in the great ways and in not great ways. It was energetic and vibrant but it was also just a more challenging environment to work in because it didn't have all the infrastructure that it would take to force good change, right? And that only happened, like, we're 12 years old, we're adolescents now, like, we know we're hitting puberty, well, we're probably beyond puberty, but you know what I mean? Like, I've talked about this with, I don't think with Ezra, but I have talked about it with Ben Smith at BuzzFeed and Lydia Polgreen at HuffPost. All of our news organizations that basically started around the same time, confronting a lot of the same challenges at the same time. And a lot of it has to do with just people management, expectation setting, growing up as a news organization. And there's a lot that's involved in that. There's a lot that's required. But it takes like broad commitment at all levels, from Tracy Schweikert, who's my HR VP here, to everyone across the news organization to have that culture shift. And it really is a culture shift that's had to happen.
I see Lauren Williams from Vox nodding her head. Startups, especially anything that's started by guys, has the potential of being a bro culture, right? And as it grows, needs to have an infrastructure for treating people who weren't part of that startup, didn't have their own money in the bank as they started it. How do you now, as a mature organization, make sure that you have the culture you want?
Well, I think that just like Carrie was saying, when I started at Vox Media almost 5 years ago, there's one person in HR, and so much of the infrastructure that exists now. We have a robust people and culture team, a robust code of conduct. It takes like real intention from your leaders to recognize, you are not the scrappy young thing anymore that can get by without this infrastructure, and B, how to like put that together quickly and confidently. And I think over the course of this last year, some of the things that our people and culture team has done to address sexual harassment in the workplace is, I think, really interesting. One of them is offering bystander training, which since the beginning of time, companies have done sexual harassment training. Sexual harassment still happens at companies all the time. But the thing that I think is really interesting about the bystander training is so often you hear these stories of unchecked sexual harassment that went on by X star from X company. Everyone knew about it, but no one said anything. And I think that empowering people and letting people know that your company will have your back if you just tell them, and they'll do something about it if you tell them, is, I think, a really important thing for everyone to know. And I think that's been just like one really great example of
And
change.
how have people accepted or invested in that bystander training?
I think that the feedback that I've gotten from my team is like, in some ways, it was sort of like, it made you think about stuff. Like, what would you do if you were at a party and you saw an executive in the corner bothering a young, assistant? Like, what would you do? And it challenged groups to really think about that. There's no one right answer, but there are several right answers. All of them sort of involve escalating it, which I think in the past some people just have not felt comfortable doing.
Right.
And I think that so much of change is empowering people who are seeing this stuff happen to tell someone.
So Loren Mayor, in the past year, you've had a promotion, right? So now you are a president. Tell us what you've been up to at NPR.
First of all, I've been thinking a lot about coming back here. Last year's meeting is still very sort of fresh in my mind, and in some ways it feels like 5 minutes ago, and in some ways it feels like 10 years ago. It's sort of very hard for me to sort of calibrate how much we've gone through. I think it's certainly been a big year for us at NPR. I mean, a year ago I talked about sort of really recognizing the fundamental about power dynamics in your organization. And one of the things that sort of emerged at NPR, at least, is that, sexual harassment is one sort of manifestation of power dynamics, but there are many, many others. And they can involve things like bullying. They can just involve sort of soft power, and really understanding how the people in your organization who have the least amount of power feel, and how the people with the most amount of power in your organization are treated. I think we've spent a lot of time trying to address that much bigger question, where I am. I think, I set out a year ago to do things that were both very tactical and more strategic. So on the very tactical side, people felt like they didn't know how to make a complaint. They didn't know who to go to. They weren't clear about what our policies were. And so we spent some time trying to fix those things, which are relatively easy, or at least you know exactly when they're done. And also how to do some bigger things that are much more about how you change the culture of an organization. And those things, I think, are more complicated and they take longer, and it's a little harder to figure out if you finish them or not. But I think we've done some useful things at our company that's helped. One of the things that I'm really proud of is early on, when all these things emerged a year ago, a number of staff came forward and said that they would like to create a peer-to-peer support group for people who had concerns largely about harassment, but a little bit more generally than that. And I talked to a number of people on my legal team and my HR team, and there was a lot of anxiety and pushback. What do you mean you're just going to have some staff around the company where anybody can go, and will they know what to do, and how will that work? One of the leaders of that, Sarah Gu, is here. It's been a really incredible effort to watch. We had a group of leaders around the company step up. They identified the right kind of training that they needed. They worked with our HR and legal teams, and we've created something of a network of people around the company that are trusted and are an open door when people have just an issue which might not be as clear as I feel like I've just been harassed. Might be, this made me feel uncomfortable and I don't know what to do.
I've got Sarah here, so let's ask her. You've been entrusted with this responsibility to have people who work side by side with you come in and unburden themselves. How did you pick the peer mentors or the peer support team, and what qualifies you to do this?
Oh boy, wow, so much.
And I want you to look at the camera right there.
Okay.
Hi. So that everybody, is that okay? Can you see her?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
All right, good. All right, go ahead.
It's hard to sum up quickly what we tried to accomplish, but the basic premise is we realized there was a huge lack of trust in HR and legal after what happened at NPR, and we wanted to restore that trust, and we wanted to go to where people were talking and confiding in one another. And we realized they had a real lack of knowledge about harassment, about our policies, about where to go. And we realized if we educated and trained them at the ground level, they're in the secret Slack channels, they're hearing, all the gossip. And they, once they had training, and we developed a whole new training program that had never really existed before, we realized that they were another resource that the company can use. And so we kind of function both to help guide people who have harassment concerns and also as a kind of heat map of the company to monitor when we see issues that really need to be addressed and they can be addressed. And it's very early, but it's really exciting.
And you went through actual professional training, though, too.
Yeah, we did. We hired a consultant, the Society of Human Resources, I don't know if I get their name right, management, who did a great job, and we developed the training with them, and so they used some of their HR training, as well as we worked with our legal teams and our HR teams to make sure that this team was super educated, knew all the ins and outs and all the gray areas that honestly really exist when it comes to harassment. And I give Loren a lot of credit for supporting that.
Okay, so everybody wants to know, what are the heat maps telling you?
They've raised some things basic, like we have an EAP program, like I'm sure most companies do, and nobody knew what they did. Nobody knew that we have like an on-site therapist who who's there 2 days a week and people didn't know it.
In addition to Loren, you mean?
So when things like, yes. So in addition, like, so for example, when the Kavanaugh hearings happened, there were a lot of people sitting on her couch and really having a moment there, and we were really grateful for that.
Because of life experiences, I
Yes,
imagine, that they had gone
absolutely.
through, and it was
That
tough
were
for them?
triggered as part of that. So that's one example, is bringing awareness, telling people where they can get support, also learning how to listen to employees. So.
Thank you. Loren, did you have something to add?
No, I've been really pleased and thrilled with the way that it's been working. I think, you know, one of the words that Sarah just ended with, I think for me has been a real touchstone throughout this whole experience, which is about listening. I can't stress to people enough how important it is to be listening to people across the organization, to create forums for that, and then to actually, once you've heard them, figure out what you're going to do to address the concerns. But it's that act of listening. I say a lot, you know, at NPR, listening is our whole business, right? We believe that listening changes the world. That's why we do what we do. But it turns out that inside the organization, the same thing is true as well, that the more you listen to the people in your company, the more of an impact you can have.
I just would follow, just to echo Loren really quickly, one of the things that we did in the last year was create these increased engagement with our newsroom, different ways to engage with senior leadership. And in that, we created 4 different types of forums, you know, a breakfast gathering, newsroom-wide meetings, a happy hour, but also office hours, which was like the most important thing we did. We got the biggest sort of wave of gratitude from folks, where they can, literally every month, every senior member of the newsroom sits down for 2 hours, where people can sign up for 30-minute sessions with any number of leaders. So you get career pathing sort of advice. Just if you have an issue that you don't want to just walk in. I always say I have an open office, open door policy, but people would say, Carrie, people don't really, they feel intimidated to walk into your office. But the level of like response from just the act of like opening yourself up to allow anybody in your newsroom to come and talk to you or any number of people has been an extraordinary thing, both for the leaders who are hearing from folks and just the sense of empowerment it gives people in the newsroom. So it's just a very small thing that has surprised me. So I just wanted to piggyback on that, the act of listening.
So Elisa Lees Muñoz, who is the executive director of the International Women's Media Foundation, at moments like this, I know that you think of all the people who aren't in organizations to have an advocate or to have a process or to have a Sarah Gu who says, you know, let me be here for you. You've raised in many forums the problems of freelancers and of women in photography who are in the field. What have you worked on in the past year since we've been together?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that struck me about what's been said is that it is still really early in this conversation. And what we have found is that this notion of reckoning is really important. And the way that organizations have responded not only to the general issue of harassment, but to how they have treated the individuals who have come forth has been really important. And in organizations where that treatment has been less than stellar, there's still a lot of distrust. So you can have as many guidelines as you want, but if the feeling is that the people who came forward and had the strength and paid the price, the heavy price, to come forward are still paying that price, then there's not a whole lot you can do to turn that around. And when it comes to freelancers, I think it really is important in the culture of the organization for that training to go all the way down and to emphasize that it's not just within your walls that you have to behave. It's also to your freelancers you're hiring. So the hiring editors have an obligation, and some organizations have worked into contracts information about how freelancers can file their own complaints against those organizations. But there's still a long way to go.
I just
Carolyn
wanted
Ryan,
to jump
New
in.
York Times, assistant managing editor.
I work at the New York Times. The one thing that I think was really set off by some of the events of the Me Too movement, at least in our newsroom, is sort of a re-examination of power and where it resides. And I think one thing that we hadn't really focused on was people way out in the field with local staff all around the world and freelancers who, when you think about power and when you think about who feels empowered to speak up, one thing that we were heartened by after the news revelations was that we started to hear from people. We trained people who work directly with freelancers, but we felt like people outside of New York on the freelance staff, that people were starting to feel comfortable talking about issues. And it felt to us, which we can be a very, New York is the engine of the place. And you realize, like, in all these little New York Times outposts around the world, there are power differentials, and there are people who may or may not feel empowered. And really getting, like, the foreign correspondents to absorb that and to embrace that and to think about, all the gradations of influence and power and stature and how that plays out and how people are treated. And I think what you're getting at, to me, it turned out to be fairly significant for us and fairly interesting.
Yeah, I think that, so what we've been getting a number of cases recently, and I think that the trickle-down effect is taking place in terms of the willingness of people to speak out in these foreign bureaus. We've heard a number of pretty horrific stories about major media organizations where local staff are fighting sexual harassment and downright attacks in some of these major media organizations that aren't based in these, there are all kinds of legal issues, they're not based in the countries. So, an organization that is headquartered in the UK, their foreign bureau is subject to the laws of that country where they're located. And so these legal battles are playing out in places like, I think one was in Tokyo, and another one was in Egypt. And I think that in terms of stories that we'll be hearing a lot more of soon, it's these complaints happening against staff in major media organizations that are headquartered in the US and in Europe who are not applying the same kind of culture that they're promoting in their headquarters, in their foreign bureaus. And so I think that we're going to be hearing a lot more of that. But the good news is that I think that the women who are being subjected to this kind of treatment are speaking out and are going to human resources. Unfortunately, how that's playing out has not yet been really satisfactory.
So to engage the group, I want to start even by asking Sharif, you didn't know I was going to do this to you, and I know you're going to be holding the mic for other people, but one of the things that came up last year and repeatedly was that this is an intersectional issue. This is not a straight white women's heterosexual issue. What has NLGJA done in the past year in the whole area of harassment and discrimination?
Well, we've faced our own challenges, and we have a diverse group. I'm the first African-American who's been elected president of the organization, which tells you a lot about where we are now, but it tells you a little bit about where we've been in the past. And the work that has been done in order to elect someone like me in the organization, but also to be more open to transgender individuals taking leadership roles, not just being on a panel, but organizing a panel and being on committees that we're setting up and helping to organize our training, which we're hoping to roll out in the next year. Getting those voices in the room when decisions are made has been a historic challenge. And so I and our entire board are pushing our organization to do better in that. And from what I'm hearing in the panel, what I'm hoping is that when we're developing trainings, when we're developing our new leaders, when we are launching our next Vox and Politico, that those initial teams have already been exposed to a lot of these issues. And so that culture of the first few years, that boys' culture that was being described, doesn't grow up in the first place. We're trying to make sure that at some point when I leave NLGA's leadership, that continues to happen with our organization as well.
So if anyone on this side of the room wants to be heard, raise your hand and let Sharif know. We're going to turn over to this side, to Julie's side, and I want to ask Maya Ragu, who's also on our advisory board of the National Women's Law Center. You've had a year. Tell us about what you've done.
Thanks, Jill. Hi, everyone. I'm Maya Ragu from National Women's Law Center. We're a national legal advocacy organization. So yes, the last 15 months have been intense and exciting. We've done several things. One of the biggest ones was through our National Women's Law Center Fund, we house and administer the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, which just celebrated its first anniversary. And I know we've spoken to you, a lot of you in the room, about some of the stories that we've heard over the last year, some of the issues that we see coming up. We've had close to almost 4,000 people call in for requests for assistance. They're coming from across the country, across industries. About 2/3 of the people are low-wage workers or self-identify as such. A lot of people of color, LGBTQ folks, all facing a lot of the issues we're talking about today, power dynamics, and a lot of retaliation. And that's something I hope we can talk about more later today, is that is one of the biggest reasons that keeps people from coming forward and one of the biggest issues that they face when they do. The other thing is intersectionality. And people wanting to be heard and have that aspect of their stories come out. The other thing that we've done this year is work a lot on legal reform across the country, both in Congress and across the states, and it won't surprise anyone to know that the real victories are coming at the state and local level, addressing some of the issues you've brought up, like what do you do about freelancers and independent contractors and people in the gig economy. So I hope we can keep talking today about the most vulnerable people in your workplaces and how we can protect them.
Sharif, if I could ask you to scoot over to Shirley Burton, unless you, I'm sorry, Julie Burton, but unless you have somebody ready right there. Right. Julie Burton is over here from the Women's Media Center. And I think it's really important to hear about, again, what you've done in the past year. And we're going to play you toward a camera, so don't mind if Sharif moves you.
You're in charge? Hey, good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you to all of you for everything you do. All of us at the Women's Media Center really value your voices, your perspectives, your leadership. So thank you for all that. The Women's Media Center has done a great deal this year. My colleague, Kate McCarthy, is here. She's the director of the WMC programs, which includes SheSource, our request for sources and experts and survivors to talk to media about what's going on in their different workplaces has been off the charts in the last year. I mean, every single day we get nearly 300 separate searches for experts on our SheSource database. But the resource request for experts, and we are providing those experts. So for those of you who are doing stories and looking for good sources and diverse sources, I really want to recommend you get to know our SheSource program, and Kate sends out an email every week so you can see for top stories of the week a complete inclusive list of potential sources that you can use. We also released a report that we think is really important. The report was 15 months of media coverage of Me Too. And we found, we went 3 months before the October story in the New York Times broke. And we found that even still with Me Too, more men were assigned to cover these stories than women. But there was a definite impact, and the women's numbers increased substantially. So it's a step forward. It's a recognition by those who do assign people to cover these stories that there needs to be more voices and dramatically more women of color voices covering these stories. But it's an improvement. Well, we will continue to monitor the media and see where we can try to push people to do better and think a little more inclusively, a lot more inclusively. And we've also done a lot of training. We do our Progressive Women's Voices training programs and others. And we will this year be doing a substantial focus on working on training more survivors, many of whom are from media, but others who are also from the farm worker sources and other places where there has not been as much attention to helping them raise and elevate their voices in the media. So,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
I'm going to look over to the other end of the room where Julie is and where I see Dan Shelley and Karen Hansen from the Radio TV Digital News Association. Some of the work is also done at conferences when you have the ability to put the agenda together. Could I ask you to stand, and I want to make sure the camera can see you, and let us know what you've been up to.
Well, as you said, we've done a lot of work at our annual convention and at regional conferences, most particularly the Anchor Leadership Summit that was referenced earlier that, Jill, you were kind enough to help us organize and facilitate. We represent mostly local radio and television and digital newsrooms across the country, but also the networks. And what we're seeing with local television companies in general is that many, if not most of them, are doubling down on sexual harassment training, doubling down on conversations in newsrooms and in executive suites about this Me Too movement and the power shift movement. And I think that's been very positive for the industry. I will say there's still a tremendous amount of work to be done, particularly in medium and smaller markets, I would say. You hear a lot these days about news deserts, which mostly refers to parts of the country where newspapers have shriveled up. There's still a lot of local journalism occurring in many of those news deserts. They're occurring in radio and television newsrooms for the most part, for a large part. And so this kind of training and discussion is even more important now than it has been in the past.
And Kathleen Graham is here from SABU, the Business Editors Association. What's going on when business editors are talking or gathering? Can I get you to stand?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Thank you. Well, we recently, at our last conference, Jill came and she led a program with Karen Testa, who's here from AP, and from Politico, their human resource manager. I think that there's a lot of work still to be done in this area. I think that you're doing some great work yourself, Jill. And I think that it's a conversation that we need to continue to have, so we're thankful to be here.
Thank you. All right, who else? Whose voice needs to be heard before I pull you out of your chair? Right. Sharif is on his way.
Hi, I'm Linda Seabrook, and I'm General Counsel and Director of Workplace Safety and Equity for the nonprofit Futures Without Violence. And thank you so much, Jill and Kate, for inviting me today. We work at Futures on social norms change and culture change. I lead a project, the only national resource center, that works with employers and workers and anti-violence advocates to build workplace cultures that promote respect and dignity and equity. We work with individual employers as well to build training because while more standardized training is a great first step, I think workers know how, where, and to whom this kind of conduct is happening, so they need to be involved in the systems and supports and policies that are intended to protect them. And what I wanted to say is that it was very interesting to me. I was watching the Today Show this morning, and they were talking about the Gillette ad that came out yesterday. And then I saw some coverage last night as well. And I just want to talk a little bit about the role of media.
Would you describe the ad for people who haven't seen it?
Sure. So I think it's a beautiful ad. It's got a play off Gillette's "Best a Man Can Get" tagline that they've had for so long, and it's kind of spinning that on its head, saying, "Is this really the best a man can get?" It kind of shows people standing up for a child that's getting bullied and speaking out for a woman who's being sexually harassed at work. So what was very interesting to me is that media, right, you're the arbiters of the cultural conversation, right? You move us all the time. And I was just shocked that the narrative went so quickly to it's a war on men and men can't do anything right, rather than, which I don't really understand, because how is showing somebody standing up against bullying and standing up against sexual harassment and assault a bad thing or a bad statement about men? But I just wanted to talk a little bit about that, is that, you know, the media's role really intrinsically as in terms of moving the cultural conversation where it needs to be.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to talk in the afternoon about coverage. The morning is focused on media organizations development. And so I'd like to stay with that and then guarantee you we will have a robust conversation in the afternoon about the things we cover and how we frame stories and the stories yet to be covered. But I'd also like to ask Gloria Riviera, who's one of the founding members. Sharif, if you could catch the microphone right over here. She's about to stand. To Gloria. Gloria Riviera from ABC is one of the founding members of Press Forward. And give us a little sense of the work, the good work that you've been doing.
Okay, thank you so much, Jill. Thanks for having us here. We're always so happy to be here in partnership with you. Press Forward was founded about a year ago, about 9 women who came together who had all had shared experiences of harassment in the newsroom, and we have a stellar board. Many of the members are here today and advisors. In the past year, we've been trying to figure out where we can be the most effective, and we decided to focus our energy in 2 places. The first is that we're launching an industry-wide study with our partner McKinsey. McKinsey, as many of you probably know, do a study on women in the workplace. They come up with some very good data, and at Press Forward, we really want to look at the hard facts of what's happening. So McKinsey has graciously agreed to work with us, specifically focusing on women in media and what their lives look like across all aspects of their experiences. We're looking for 7 companies with a minimum of 1,000 employees. And really our challenges, and I think part of the update here is where the challenges are. And so while many, many organizations have expressed interest in participating, we're still looking for that first signature on the dotted line. And I know we've worked closely with members on the panel to help us figure out the best way to do that. I think it really reflects some of the reticence and nerves and anxiety that are still very much present in getting companies to take action. And I think that's from the top on down. So that is a big focus for us. We're excited to have received a grant from CBS as well. That's really going to help us move forward on that front. And the other area that we've decided to focus on is in training. And as 9 founders, we come with a variety of backgrounds, media, legal, consulting, the arts. And it's been an incredible experience to try to put that together to figure out how we can best look at training, develop training, ask for partners in training. Jill has been wonderful in leading the way for us, and we're looking at where we can be most effective. I have focused on journalism schools, and it's been an incredible experience to go speak to predominantly many journalism schools, of course, as Jill knows, young women, but young women who are absolutely experiencing harassment in internships, in job interviews, at school. So that's a brief overview of where we are, and we're excited to move forward. Excited about the grant from CBS and excited to keep working with PowerShift. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, you mentioned schools, and we have a number of universities represented here, but I want to start with a recent student, Shira Stein, who helped us early this year with a project that we did called Power to the Interns, in which we talked about the vulnerability of interns, and now you've graduated into the world of work, but you still are talking to young people. We realized that we had not been preparing interns at all for the potential of sexual harassment on the job. So what's your message?
I mean, I graduated back in May, and I've been in the workforce permanently now for about 8 months. And my experience has been seeing that schools are talking about it, but it's still in the early stages. Kind of what the conversation we're having today is that we're a year later, but we still have a lot left to be done. I was a former intern at my company that I now work for, and so when the interns came in this summer, I spent a lot of time getting to know them and talking with them because they really wanted to connect the former interns with the current interns. And I'm doing the same thing now as we're starting to hire the interns for this next summer. And I feel like there is more of an openness for those interns to feel comfortable talking to us. But I know personally, as somebody who, I know my bosses support me with talking about these kind of issues and going to things like this, but it's still nerve-wracking to be able to even ask them, oh, can I spend a day talking about how to combat sexual harassment in the workplace instead of working on my normal reporting job? So there's still those nerves, especially for those of us who are lower on the totem pole in our newsroom, who have less power, who are passionate about these issues.
Okay. Other universities, what are you doing? Lynn?
I work remotely for...
Introduce yourself, please. I'm
Lynn
sorry.
Adrian. I run the DC graduate program in digital and broadcast journalism for Syracuse University's Newhouse School. I work remotely since I'm here in Washington, and my students come to Washington to report for small market television stations around the country. So they're here in the summer actually doing their own reporting, and it airs on stations around the country. Because of that, I'm not in the classroom with them, but it does also give me the opportunity to have conversations, since this is their capstone right before they graduate. It gives me the opportunity to generate conversations with them about what their concerns are about the workplace they're going into. And I certainly saw a great shift last summer in terms of awareness of what the possible challenges may be for people, primarily women, entering the workforce, and what strategies may be. I've included speakers in our semester about the issues facing women in the workforce, Me Too, et cetera. We've had a lot of conversation about allyship and how to work together, how to support each other so that you don't feel like the Lone Ranger. When they go to their first jobs, and they're usually in smaller markets, they don't know where they're going. They don't know anything about the culture of that particular organization. Although I also will say that they are spending more time and doing more research about individual organizations and stations to have an idea of where they're going. I don't know if hiring managers are aware that people are looking at them more closely, but I do think that that's a positive.
Okay, thank you. Somebody just whispered in my ear, through my earpiece, that we are trending on Twitter. So those of you who are on social media, thank you. Katie Culver from the University of Wisconsin.
And friend of Jill. Thank you, Jill. So on the same note, I mean, I think one of the most difficult things of Me Too for me personally was seeing some former students who I had helped to place in internships in which they were then harassed. That was just, I was gobsmacked. And so a few things that we've done in response to that. Number one, at the departmental level, we've gotten some great advice from Jill and from the PowerShift training that I went through as a train the trainer. I highly recommend it. To work with faculty advisors of interns. I really want to reinforce the point that you made earlier, Loren, about listening, that we're supposed to be in the business of listening. But in listening to students who have gone through this, I found they felt they had no voice at all. They couldn't speak, so they couldn't be heard. And so what we've tried to do is encourage advisors and faculty supervisors to just sort of open that door before you leave to go on the internship to say, if there's anything that's a barrier to you, we want to hear about that barrier, because we're not only going to help you, but we're going to help kids who are in that job after you. So what are the things that are standing in between you and success? Just basically trying to say, the ear is here. If you feel you can't talk in your internship, you can talk here. And then doing a little bit more with formalized training. And I have to say, for the first time ever, I'm embarrassed to say it was the first time ever, but for the first time ever in my class this semester, in the fall semester, I began more formally making the point that if you feel like you can't talk to us, you sure can talk to your peers. And from that, word may begin to bubble up more. So small steps, but important steps.
You made a good point about how embarrassing it is to think for the first time ever we've brought this subject up into a higher level in our conversations. Now, for the Women's Media Center and the International Women's Media Foundation, that is your conversation. But for the rest of the people in the room, I'd love to see a show of hands. How many people consciously in this past year have introduced the subjects of harassment, discrimination, or incivility into your conversations in ways you haven't before? Well, that should be trending. Julie.
Hi, my name is Caroline Freysinet. I am the internship coordinator for USC School of Cinematic Arts. One big change is that I've joined the team. So we have somebody on staff now to focus specifically on students and internships. And my goal has really been a combination of education as well as creating an infrastructure where they can communicate with me directly if something comes up. So part of the education, I think, is students don't always realize that they have rights. So I've been communicating that with them much more regularly, saying, you know, you have rights when you're on an internship. And this is, some things that you should be aware of when you're on an internship that you should not be experiencing, should be experiencing. And if something comes up, I encourage my students to come to me and call me directly and tell me about those things. That way, if there is an organization that is not behaving in a professional manner, we can do something about it.
Julie, Barbara Cochran from University of Missouri and the National Press Club Foundation is right here. I think that's a friend of yours, isn't it?
Our new executive director. We're so happy she's here with you today. Yes, I'm with the University of Missouri running the Washington program. And we've been talking about this issue in our weekly seminars for more than a year, pretty intensively. And Keith Woods, who I see across the room there, we visit every semester, and I have a good seminar with him about all kinds of diversity and inclusion issues and so on. So that's been a part of our what we're doing here. And back on campus, there's certainly been increased attention. There have been some special sessions. And one of the things that we're finding with our students is that it's the atmosphere that they're running into is it's not just fears about sexual harassment. There's other kinds of harassment and fears that they are dealing with. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important for us to think about how these students are entering what they consider to be kind of a dangerous workplace. We had the shootings at the Capitol Gazette. My own students dealt with really vicious harassment when they published things as interns for professional organizations. And I'm sorry to say they did not get a lot of help from the newsrooms where they were working. Luckily, I'm a resident instructor, so I can go and visit the places where they're working and talk to their supervisors about this problem, try to raise their consciousness that when somebody is subjected to online trolling, you can't just say to them, oh, brush it off, it's not important. And it is, especially with social media, one of my students said, well, I've been online since I was in the 6th grade, so I have to go back and look at everything that I've ever written because it can be used as a weapon against me, what I wrote when I was, a 7th grader. So those are just some of the things that I've been thinking about.
I just want to jump in for a second on that. I do think that when we think about what is the ethos of a newsroom and how do we, what do we consider courage? And it feels like when people like me were coming up, there was a notion that part of how you proved your toughness was that nothing mattered. You could get attacked, you could get angry phone calls. It was really a badge of honor. And we've really had to shift our thinking around this, given the attacks, especially on women online, prominent women in our newsroom, the doxing, the revelations about addresses, family members, parents. And one thing that we have done, as Me Too, in the Me Too movement, is just think about security in a different way and think about it more expansively. And I think you're really hitting on something. And I think the piece that is coming next on that is, what do we tell people about what our expectations are for how they will be treated, and what is our culture around the vulnerability of that. And that feels like a piece that's very urgent, and it feels like letting go of some of the legacy notions of how you handle criticism and attacks is like very much in front of us right now.
One of the fears that photojournalists have often talked about is, if I tell you that what I've seen has bothered me or what I've experienced is bothering me, you won't send me to the next assignment that I really want. Yeah. Elisa?
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. I was going to go to the safety place next, because I think that one of the things that keeps us from really addressing these issues like they should be is that these are safety issues and they should be considered as serious. And so I'm even moving away from calling it online harassment and calling it online attacks, because they're attacks. In a recent IWMF study that we did, a survey showed that these kinds of attacks have the same effects as physical attacks. There are symptoms of PTSD. Young people in particular, young women, but young people under 40 are leaving the profession more quickly because of these online attacks. And so we're going to be left with even less of a pool of journalists to choose from if we don't start addressing this. And one of the things with that this ties to is also research, because it is difficult to get research on this. We approached a couple of dozen media organizations and asked them to distribute a survey to their staff that was going to be kept anonymous, but that they could get the results to, so they could see. We thought that we were offering something that media organizations would want, which is to see how their staff are being treated online so that they could offer some kind of response. Not one media organization took us up on this offer. One said, oh my goodness, the survey is so alarming, I don't want to scare my staff. And we were thinking, buddy, they're already scared. Like, we're not scaring them. So not one. And so this goes to the Press Forward research as well. Getting organizations to participate in research, even when they're going to be kept anonymous, is incredibly difficult. And if media organizations really want to contribute to improving the situation, participating in this kind of research would be a really good first step. And being kept the fact that you're being kept anonymous, I don't think that there's any excuse. But there are a lot of safety resources. Part of our the funds that we're going to be using from the CBS grant is on online harassment training around the country, especially in sectors in the middle of the country and in small media organizations that get so few resources to address these things. But I think that working together, the grantees of the CBS funds, that money will go to good use. But these are safety issues. They might start as sexual harassment, which people can brush off, but they escalate, and they're just, it's a matter of safety.
Loren, and then I'll go to Sarah.
Yeah, I'm so glad that this was brought up, because it's something that people in our newsroom are dealing with every day. That's sort of like, some people think that because they chose this job, it's just like their cross to bear, which is terrible. But many more are understanding that it's not something that they have to deal with. Fox Media has this wonderful online harassment task force that anytime, day or night, you drop into Slack, say, something's, I wrote this story, I'm getting X number of replies, or even, sometimes they're monitoring when author pages have more traffic than usual, because that usually means that you're on, some 4chan board and people are plotting against you and letting writers know ahead of time. We have a lot of anti-doxing resources. We're trying to be as proactive as we can, but until Twitter, follows suit and, protects our people from harassment a little better, and until we, there's only so much you can do.
So what you're talking about, I think, is fascinating, especially to smaller organizations who may not have a task force, but may want to know a couple of the key insights of what your task force does, or even individuals what they could do. Is there anything you can share with us in terms of specifics or tips that the task force has applied when someone reports to them that they are getting horrible things texted to them or on Twitter, or getting doxxed, having all their information released?
There's the proactive part of it where they distribute materials to staff on how to get your address, your phone number, and any identifying information offline. So a list of websites where you can go and get yourself removed, and obviously two-factor authentication on everything you log into. There's that part, and then there's the part where if it's happening to you, if you're getting harassed on Twitter, if there's a targeted attack, we will sometimes give the keys to a person's Twitter account to someone else for a weekend. That someone else will go in and purge all of the terrible things from their Twitter account when they sign back on. They don't have to see all of the terrible things eventually, you know, some of those targeted attacks, they eventually fade away. So it's both trying to protect your information and also just trying to protect your sanity in the moment that it's happening.
And we know from research that women in particular are targeted more than others, as are other marginalized people. And so this really is a quality of the workplace issue for managers, how we respond when our people are under assault, as you say, not calling it harassment, calling it attack. Sarah Gu from NPR, and then we'll go right behind you after that. Sharif?
Right, this is on the related topic of human resources.
Yeah, I guess just related to the changing the culture that we've been talking about is, one thing I'd love to hear a year later is how human resources has changed, because when we started to peel back the onion of things we needed to change within the newsroom, we tried to find support that, again, was very ground level and thinking very differently than I think typically human resources is thought of. It's very much about protecting the top, sending out the policies, doing video training that we all know is very inadequate for harassment. And so it was really hard to find folks in the human resources industry who even understood what we were trying to do or had anything available that was outside the box that could help us. We did eventually find it, but I guess I would love to hear from the room, I'm seeing like Tracy from HR and other folks here, about what that industry is going through, and are they really recognizing this problem? Are you in your newsroom working with your other departments differently, more creatively? I'd love to hear that.
One thing that is different for us, the way that the New York Times had grown up was you sort of had this apparatus within the newsroom that almost mimicked HR but wasn't HR, and was kind of more spare and sort of a little bit more ad hoc. And kind of concurrently, in the wake of Me Too, but not really triggered it, it just happened that way, we've much more integrated HR into the newsroom. So we have HR partners in the newsroom. We have HR partners working really closely with department heads. And a lot of what they do is underscoring the broader policies we're putting in place. So they sort of become the listening posts and the explainers, and they can get into the weeds a little bit more. And so it doesn't sound radical, but for the New York Times to have such a presence of HR, you know, among its journalists is quite different. So that does feel different.
Okay. We're going to go to Beck Feldhaus-Adams from WAMU.
Good morning. I wanted to add to this conversation. We're talking about some really serious things that happen and are out there, like trolls. You can kind of have the idea of don't feed the troll. That has some flaws to it. But one thing that we're experiencing, and that we experienced after women in my organization started talking, is our sources. And what do you do when the only person you can really talk to, especially in local news, if they're a leader in the community, how do you handle that? And our development peers were also really interesting in saying, how do you deal with someone who is a major donor or a member who is an important part of your organization? If you're working with a membership organization, that's a really tricky area, and we
these
have not
people are
landed on it.
acting in ways that make women very uncomfortable.
Yes, and so we don't have an answer, but that's a conversation I wanted to raise, because in some ways it's not, you know, we're not being doxxed that I'm aware of, but those things do come up on a regular basis.
So that is a threat as well. And so we asked about HR. We know that we're going to hear from Tracy Schweikert. Are there other HR voices in the room that, okay, we'll bring you in on this conversation too. We'll start with Tracy. Tracy Schweikert of Politico, who's head of HR.
Hey, everybody. I know that as we've talked about this conversation, the conversation about HR has always been a big piece of it. I think, you know, I said this last year when we were here, you know, everything that happened on our watch, and we didn't do all the things that we needed to do. From an HR standpoint, I think we did what was legally required. I think what we've started to see, we've certainly done a lot in terms of Politico. Other organizations that I know and HR folks have certainly done more. We focus more on the culture we want to have instead of just what we're legally required to do. And so at Politico in particular, what that looks like is, in addition to listening, making sure that we're present. making sure that we're available, making sure that we are in the newsroom on a regular basis so that we can build that trust, making sure that we are having conversations not about what our policy is, but what is our culture and what do we expect of every employee. We do talk about active bystander training. We do talk about being allies. But making sure that we are bringing forward conversations about the whole of the culture rather than just making sure that we're checking the boxes with training. And I do see more and more HR folks doing that. It's certainly a conversation that's being had at Society for Human Resource Management and other organizations. But I think looking for partnership is really important.
Can you just elaborate a little bit on what that means, training versus the broader culture piece?
So, one of the things that, and I think many people have talked about it in the room before, is we used to do online training because it was legally required. Right? And so somebody sitting at their desk going through training, sure, you pick up a couple of tidbits about what's legally required, but you probably have a lot of other questions. At Politico, we've had a lot of good conversations, and we've separated those between employees and managers so that managers feel comfortable asking questions. I had managers say, well, what happens when I hear something second and third hand? Do I have a responsibility to do something with that? How do I deal with that? And so we've tried to have conversations about what does it really look like every day? What do I do with that little piece of information? What am I required to do? What does Politico want me to do with that information? Rather than just, hey, watch this video, okay, we can check the box and move on. So it's a lot more of those sorts of things. As part of new employee orientation, we're not just talking about the policies. We're talking about this is Politico. This is the culture that we want, and that means that we're collaborative. That means that we're respectful to each other. That means that we're inclusive. And we have conversations about what that might look like. And if you are met with a situation where you don't see that, who are the people that you can go to? Who are the people within the newsroom? Who are the people within HR? Who are the people across the organization that you can go to? Giving people real-world things to do when they're confronted with something and they're like, oh my God, what do I do? So now that hopefully they know.
The complexity issue, I think, is so important. As you said, what do I hear when I hear about it third hand? Because one of the takeaways from last year that was so big to all of us was we were compliance-based. We were looking at what were the limits of the law and how do we express those to people so everybody knows them and follows them. But everything that was happening didn't always rise to the level. In fact, the things that were making people uncomfortable every day. I worry that we've used the term microaggressions as though that's a tiny thing. If I stick you with a needle once or twice a day, it's not going to take your life, but you're not going to want to hang around with me, And I think that those are the kinds of things that never reached HR or people thought HR didn't want to hear about. And so the questions now are, how are we dealing with that?
Yeah, and I think the other piece of it, and some of you have mentioned it too, this whole idea of I have to pay my dues and I have to be tough. Well, so many people, I actually had women come to me as all the stories were unfolding a year ago saying, man, I had these things in my past and I didn't say anything. Was that wrong of me not to have said something? Maybe if I had said something at company X, Y, and Z, some of these other things wouldn't have happened. And so instantly there was this guilt because we had been tough, that shame on us that we hadn't brought this to the forefront before. And so I think, yes, it's having the conversation about, am I comfortable? Am I not comfortable? And if I'm not comfortable, I want to talk about it, and who can I go to talk to about it, whether it is walking into Carrie's office or scheduling time for office hours, whether it is just going to someone on my HR team and just saying, hey, this doesn't feel right. I don't know if it's wrong. I don't know if it's against the law, but I don't feel right, and I don't know what to do with it. And so we have to give people that opportunity.
Well, let's shift over to the Associated Press and Jessica Bruce. I'm sorry, just 1 second. You were going to say something, Loren?
I was just going to say just one example of a non-compliance-based training that we did at NPR. We brought in folks from Second City to do communications training. And as you might imagine, there was a lot of skepticism around our journalists that you're going to make us do improv. But I will say that everybody that went to it really got a lot out of it, and it was really about just how to talk to each other. So it was just a different take on what training means.
And they kept their first careers, right? All right, Jessica Bruce from Associated Press.
Thank you. I run human resources and corporate communications and security and safety, so it's kind of the intersection of all terrible things that happen at a company. The AP's had women in key critical executive positions for quite some time now, and I think that I cannot stress representation is just so important. We've not been struck the way some others have, I think specifically because of that. But we have made some specific changes. We have internationally, we have amazing challenges to deal with. There are things we have to deal with. It's still legal to punch somebody in some countries before you can write them up. But it's certainly not according, you can't do that at the AP, and so how do you manage through those situations? We will find ways to fire people when we need to, but it's a challenge. I think we're very, very interested in the harassment and the attacks that people of color and women specifically get, our journalists get in response to stories, in response to any kind of stories, photos and stories. So AS&E, APME, and the Associated Press, that's kind of our current topic. The other thing we have done is we've changed, right around the Oresco situation, the way we respond publicly, and even inside the AP, to allegations where, no comment, or we don't comment on personnel matters was just the go-to statement at all times. And we had some really great heated discussions with our executive editor and me, saying, kind of working our way through that. And our position has now changed to we will give as much information as we possibly can. It's never as much as everybody wants, but as much, much, much more than we used to about these situations as they go forward. And it's done a lot for trust and people's willingness to come forward. So happy to talk about any of those things with anybody who's interested.
I mean, how do you balance the expectation of privacy among employees, both those are accused and people who are bringing the concerns forward? Because that has been a tricky line.
It is.
In the interest of transparency and the hunger for transparency from the staff is so intense. And these are among the most sensitive personnel issues that we deal with.
It's case by case. So we have a case where the woman who was absolutely harassed said, please, you can tell anybody you want. And that was very helpful. I mean, it's terrible, but it was helpful, and so we felt more comfortable there. We had the accused in one situation said, yeah, I did bad things and I shouldn't have. That was also really helpful because he's also, in this situation, it was a man, kind of already admitted publicly that he did something, so we don't have that perpetual slander liability. The Associated Press, we're not rich, as one really good lawsuit could tip us in the wrong direction. So we still have to be very careful, but it's case by case. We work with HR, legal, and news and figure out what we can say.
You have all struggled with this, with not just what you give out publicly as a news release, but one of the things that we consistently hear is people in the organization think something wasn't done because they didn't hear a report back about how this particular complaint was adjudicated. And I know that it's a legal challenge, but it seems that over the past year there has been, as we say, a power shift. There has been a shift toward finding as much transparency as you can. What have you done in that area when you have had to deal with that or other personnel issues?
We've certainly gone further than in the past in describing the circumstances, especially for some high-profile situations. We can't always do it. Dean Baquet did something pretty interesting on one particular very prominent case where he basically walked the staff not just through the results, but kind of how he got there and how the people who made the decision got there. And you could kind of feel the discomfort in parts of the room that were just not used to sharing. I mean, personnel is an area that in newsrooms first was kind of underdeveloped, and then it was very secret. So I think that feels like a little bit of a opening up, and certainly going further than we would have in the past.
Yes, go ahead.
Just to say, this has been an area that we've really grappled with. And I throughout this past year, I keep saying, like, there's just no roadmap. I mean, it's really uncertain what to do at each step of the way. We made a pretty unusual step in a couple of situations where a personnel issue came up to involve the entire team. In one case, we actually effectively had somebody with HR present and the team present talk about what had happened, share with the entire team what our action plan going forward was, and do regular checkups with that team. We felt that there was a path forward, a very effective path forward through the organization, but we were very concerned that if we just said to people, don't worry, we got it, that was not going to be effective at that time. But it was very challenging to know whether, in fact, that was the right thing and whether we did the right balance of transparency and privacy in that case. We've also taken the step, by and large, to share with the entire staff basically any research or work that we've done. So there was a board-led investigation of the harassment issues in our organization. We published that publicly to the world. We did a climate survey to try to understand our climate. We've kept that as an internal document, but we published the entire results to the whole company, not just your team, so people could see everything.
And I just want to take a moment. Sarah Glover has arrived, and working journalist that she is, she was wrapping up a few things for her day job, but as soon as she's wrapping that up, she's going to join us up here on the stage, Sarah, as one of our board members and president of the National Association of Black Journalists. Everybody say hi to Sarah. Right. So Sarah, as soon as you wrap, come on and join us on the stage. Sharif.
Hi, my name is Soraya Shamali, and I'm with the Women's Media Center, an initiative called the Speech Project, which we launched that focuses on increasing women's civic and political participation, specifically on this issue of online violence. And the initiative was based on a network that was established earlier around 2013 that's global, of women working at the nexus of gender-based violence, freedom of expression, and technology. So we have worked very intensely with social media companies, sometimes to good effect, sometimes to not. And we've also engaged in conversations in newsrooms. And I really wanted to stress a couple of things that Elisa said as resources. One is that this issue of how online harassment is defined is important. The language that we tend to use is traditionally trivializing the way violence against women has been trivialized. So we have a detailed taxonomy that I urge you to look at. It delineates what is currently illegal in the United States versus what is just emotionally resonant and threatening, and that's important for us to know. I think urging people to use the right language when they are describing what happens to them is really important, because it allows institutions to hone in on exactly what the nature of the threat is. Again, we've had a lot of issues with getting organizations to assess their own climates. And we've been invited into newsrooms, and we have only gone if the newsroom will do a survey. It is anonymous, but there's something super important that I want to share with you, which is that in the survey that we constructed, we asked one very important question, and that was about people's offline experiences of violence. And until you make the connection between what is happening offline and the tactics that are being used online, it's sometimes hard to convince senior management of why it's important. Because the standards in journalism, as we've discussed, have always been, sort of suck it up and just dig in and be stronger about what you're doing. But in fact, those standards don't address the traditional vulnerabilities that women and marginalized people face. So in our experience, you generally have at very senior levels, frankly, a lot of men, who haven't had these experiences. And the survey enables us to say, you know what? You didn't realize that between 25 and 35% of the women on your staff has experienced harassment, stalking, rape, domestic violence, which goes a long way to explaining why the harassment is different, why the security, privacy, and digital security issues are relevant. And the way I would categorize it is that when women join these institutions, we are generally expected to reach a bar established by men in their experiences of notability and of work and of violence. But in fact, we have these radically different experiences. And those experiences become institutional vulnerabilities. And the institutions aren't seeing that as a systemic problem. And so the biggest difference that I see between institutions that are addressing it well and those that aren't are that they form, interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary teams. Because we've been in newsrooms where legal has asked us in, but then a month later, the tech organization will call us and say, there's no connection between what they're doing and what we know.
Right.
This institution just hired a security team that has absolutely zero awareness of what online harassment is. And so being able to establish those cross-disciplinary teams as working groups is, I think, very fundamental to assessing the climate and to making the connection with offline and online violence.
Thank you so much, and we'll hear more from you this afternoon. And I think in addition to saying suck it up, there was also a tradition of engage. You know, there was this automatic, well, we want to increase engagement, and so if it isn't so bad, you know, see if you can just bring them around. And now we realize that that may not always be the wisest idea, right? It can lead, in fact, to something even worse. Have any of you changed your conversation around engagement or response? You talked about having, obviously, your task force, but have there been other conversations in the workplace around how the immediate response should be to online messages that are really upsetting to the recipient?
The problem, Jill, is that there isn't one right response. You know, there are so many different factors that go into how one might respond, and so that's why it's really critically important that all newsrooms have some kind of expertise or know where to seek out expertise and begin the process of orientation with their journalists, you know, to think about online attacks before, during, and after, which is how we're approaching it. You know, what do you do before you're attacked? You know, what are the steps that you can take to make sure that you're as protected as possible? And not reading your messages and having somebody else read them is great, but deleting them is not great because evidence, and also you need to be able to assess when you need to start considering that threat has changed from being simply an online threat. Who do you go to when you're sitting at your desk if you don't have anybody in your own media organization to go to, or if you're a freelancer? We were speaking to a woman who was about to publish a major story on the Ukraine in a major media organization, and I said to her, you know, I hope you're prepared. And she said, for what? And I said, for the onslaught of online harassment that you're going to be getting really, really soon. She wasn't prepared. She hadn't thought about it. So we connected her with a digital security expert, but this was a conversation we were having over dinner. And, you know, I think these conversations just have to happen more.
But Soraya's insight about the disconnect between your technology team and your content team is, you know, to me, a key revelation for today. Absolutely. For us to be really looking at. Go ahead. Just
a really quick point, which is it's colliding, in my view, with something bigger, which is a story goes out, and we've been trained and conditioned, and our muscles are now to engage and to create and to sustain. And it's not just publishing a story, it's creating a conversation about it. And our social media policy directly discourages blocking, muting, you know, all these things that a private individual might do to preserve a little sanity and a little bit of a bubble. And so, you know, it's on the one hand, we are pushing people to jump in and to have a deeper conversation. And on the other hand, some of the tools that could keep that more civil aren't really available to us in the way that we are supposed to conduct ourselves. And I think we pride ourselves on sort of being open to social media criticism and to be polite. And it is a very messy stew right now.
I mean, I would say to that point, something we did in the last year, Tracy should correct me if I'm wrong, but we used to provide ways to reach our journalists online through the bio pages, and we just shut down that system after some women had complained to us about just the level of, you know, how it just affected them personally. So it's the tension that Carolyn speaks of, which is that as a journalist, you want to engage with readers. You're told, you grow up saying you want to engage with people who reach out to you. You never know when you'll find the next story tip from someone finding you. And we are closing off that sort of channel because we need to preserve the sanity and health of our reporters, at least that one, and also slimming down how much they disclose about themselves online. I did that myself, where at one point I had a bio years ago that had more personal information, just whimsical stories about, not whimsical stories about me, but like one little detail that's giving a little bit, and that was taken and used against me in a very personal way. That like, I don't want to share anything about myself for fear of like just having it thrown back at me, but really cutting off that love, that ability to communicate. Of course, you can probably find, any smart person can figure out how to contact a Politico journalist, but we generally are making it harder because of the environment
And as you make it harder, or as organizations make it harder for good reasons, it's important to keep in mind that there are still organizations that judge their staff on their ability to be influencers. How many followers do they have? How much engagement do they have? And so if that is a measure, we may be keeping someone from growing because we've chosen to protect them. And so you have to be mindful on both of those scores of what we're doing as leaders.
I mean, the additional wrinkle is online, when you're engaging with people and supposed to be open, is that there are groups that are, critical in good faith, and then there are groups that are critical because they just want to get you.
Right.
And it is very difficult, particularly when there's a huge onslaught, for writers and editors to sort of differentiate between like, oh, we really should have done this differently, or this is good feedback, versus like, they just hate us and are trying to score a point, and it just further toxifies the environment.
If I may get personal, let me just ask you, you're a journalist, you're a woman, you're a person of color, you are the head of an organization. That makes you a target from so many angles. How do you deal with it?
I'm going to be perfectly honest, I don't get that much. But I think one of the reasons I don't is because I don't tweet. I don't tweet very much. Whenever I write something, it comes in waves. But it's so interesting that like the less you actually engage, the less people engage with you. I don't think that that's great or not the answer. And obviously for work, a lot of people need to be very involved in these social media platforms. But I think it's a direct connection between how much I tweet, how much I present myself on Twitter, and how much crap I get.
Okay, thank you. Julie?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Claire Constance, and I am a researcher at Fors Marsh Group. We're a social and behavioral science research firm, a friend of the museum, and I just want to first say how impressed I am by both how you're thinking about the challenges you're facing and the solutions you've created so far to address them. With that in mind, I do want to raise somewhat more, since it has been brought up a little bit today, the value and potential for research being a little bit of an unbiased third party in setting some of the agendas and roadmaps that you're looking at, and also charting the progress forward. To the first, I understand that there is likely continuing to be in your lives right now and into the future significant barriers to getting people excited about evaluating themselves and how they're doing at their jobs and treating each other. That being said, getting that buy-in early on from people like you in the room, the leaders who can then embrace transparency with that data and use it to facilitate those conversations on a regular basis, can concretize these questions we're asking around what culture change can be and how we want to think about it and what we want it to look like X many years down the road. My ask of you is that even though it's early, you use research to be really explicit about what that agenda is. Bring in the opinions of your employees and your colleagues in setting those guideposts and using them to lead you forward. If you would like to talk further about how you can potentially soften the blow and get that buy-in to have some of those research conversations, that is what we do at Fors Marsh Group, and we would love to help you.
Thank you. Thank you. Sheree?
So we have a follow-up on the topic of sources potentially being problematic.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of circle back to that idea, because I know in the conversations I have with other women in newsrooms and other marginalized people in newsrooms, we're more concerned about that right now, to be quite honest. At least on the reporter level, the people that I know are more concerned about that than necessarily the harassment in their own newsrooms. I'm a reporter, I cover Capitol Hill, and so there's the whole, you're as good as your sources, and on Capitol Hill that means schmoozing them, whether that's going to drinks or going to coffee. And I know when I first started covering Capitol Hill with this job, I kind of consciously made the decision to focus more on doing coffee source meetings at like 10 or 11 a.m. in the morning, because there was less likelihood of any sort of impropriety. But I have friends who are concerned, and fellow reporters who are concerned that, you know, maybe the things that they're doing aren't on the level of harassment, but they make them feel just a little bit uncomfortable. But these are people who are really important in their industry, and they're people that they need to talk to. And I feel like that's a part of the conversation that we're kind of missing right now, is the idea that, especially in Washington and New York, sources are people in massive positions of power. They have ability to make or break your story, especially when you're covering a place like Capitol Hill or a certain industry. And I don't know that we're really having that conversation yet.
If I could weigh in on that, I feel like I get asked that question a lot. I mean, until I became a manager 4 years ago, I feel like this was it wasn't discussed enough among young women. I started covering politics in my 20s in state capitals, and came to Washington when I was 30, and covered Congress, covered campaigns, covered the White House. And I very much sort of kept it, like, it's a conversation that we should be having. Like, I definitely went about my job differently because I was a woman, and how I sourced, how I got information, the places I chose to put myself. I think I put myself at a bit of a disadvantage because I wasn't always comfortable meeting a male source, of which there were many in this world that I had to deal with for happy hours. And so I had to find my places where I felt comfortable and use my own good instincts, and then also band together with other women to use our collective power to bring high-level people to speak with us. I did that as a White House correspondent. But the place I came to was, like, I always felt more comfortable doing coffees. I'm not a big drinker to begin with. If I did want to do a drink, I'd do it at 5. And this is all a personal choice. Women also shouldn't feel like they can't do these things, right? Female reporters should be able to do whatever they want to do, damn it, right? If they want to go out and have drinks with a source at 8 p.m., they should be able to do that without that source thinking that there's something more up. So, like, I'm not saying that, like, women shouldn't do that. It was just a matter of finding what I was comfortable with. And it's okay if you're not. It's okay. Just there are other ways to get information, right? But I do think that's, like, I was a reporter before the Me Too movement. I think these conversations are happening in greater numbers. But it was very much, I wondered if I was put at a disadvantage as a female reporter in this town for many years for that reason.
Well, I love the way you put that. I mean, it was men who decided that we do business on a golf course, right? They had the power to do that. If someone had decided that we were going to do it instead over a knitting circle, that's where the power would be, right? That's where we would sit and talk. And you have the right to decide as the reporter or as the leader. If you want to go out at 8, fine. But if I say coffee is what works, that's what works. Alfredo Carbajal from ASNE and Al Dia and the Dallas Morning News.
Thank you, Jill. I want to go back to try to answer the original question of the session on where are we right now? What is it that happened in the last year that I think is positive? And I just want to say 2 things. From my perspective, I think the number one is awareness on how complex this issue in terms of misconduct, in terms of harassment, in terms of improper behavior, and also incivility. And I think probably we've been, in society, have been paying attention to the high-profile cases and big names, but the awareness that probably we have now in newsrooms, especially at the leadership level, and I would like to think at all levels, is that those elements of incivility, those microaggressions, those elements of ignoring or not having the representation of the other, it's now something that we're thinking on. So I think that's a really positive element. It's not just about the blatant aggression. It's about many of the things that happen, and I think we have a responsibility to do that. The other element, too, that I think it's probably one of the next steps on this, it's the empowerment of mid-level leaders and middle managers. We do empower and demand from them high standards, and we actually entrust the quality of the journalism that we produce, the content, in terms of sources, in terms of ethics, in terms of quality control. But in many cases, and probably this is pretty much the reckoning place for the reckoning moment for us in the industry, we have not done enough to empower them with the tools, with the training, and the decision making on how to not only handle situations of misconduct, but also how to prevent those. So I think those are the two things that I see that are kind of steps forward on it.
Thank you. And before we go over to Julie, and I will in a second, I'm going to hand this microphone because Sarah is not wired up. I know that at the NABJ convention this past year, there was an entire session on the Me Too movement and the intersection of race and gender. But what else from NABJ's point of view should we know about?
Thank you, Jill, and appreciate the forum coming back for a second year, because I think sometimes to the root of this discussion, people might say, well, why do we have to talk about it? Why do you have to talk about, or, we're addressing these issues, or, we have training within newsrooms, or there are systems in place if you have an issue that you know how to report this. But the reality is that there's so many things that are happening in newsrooms and in society at large that's not illegal, but it's wrong, right? And I think these conversations and talking about these issues and really helping people segue through their career is what also we need to be talking about. And so then we add on the layer of women and marginalized groups, so that's LGBT as well as women of color. And then when we're broadening out these conversations, there are various issues that also elevate into the conversation. And so the issues that a woman of color or a black woman or a Latina, or an Asian woman, they can be different, but they can also be shared experiences. And I think it's really critical that whether you're in newsroom management, or you're in HR, or you're outside of the newsroom in public life, that you really seek areas within your organizational structure so that everyone has an inclusive, not just feeling or an institutional acceptance, right, in terms of your hiring practices, but how are you really creating an opportunity for conversation around issues that are impacting women of color. So, clearly at NABJ, we're having those conversations. And I think, to start it off, it's like, who has a seat at the table? I think you have to do that, your own heart-to-heart analysis within your organization. Who's physically making the decisions? Who is influencing those decisions? If there are not people of color involved in those conversations, if there are not LGBTQ people involved in those conversations, I think right off the bat you have a problem. And so it's not enough just to have people of color or marginalized groups on your staff, but who's actually making the decisions. And so I think that, having that heart-to-heart direct conversation, and then also, like I said earlier the beginning of my comments, a lot of what's happening here isn't just about sexual harassment. And when I say what's happening here, I think we need to get to the root of this. And it's not just about the things that are illegal. There's lots of things that are happening within newsrooms and in staffing situations that may not be illegal, but they're wrong. Yeah. And, in the past, we might call it the good old boys club, or we had other terms for those terms. We're talking about pathways to career development, understanding and pathways to women and their workplace issues. Being a parent, both a male parent and a female parent, is very important, right? That you have work-life family balance, but the female parent has different nuances. And so we have to have those conversations. It's critical. And clearly with NABJ, we're trying to draw attention to those issues. And I really encourage you to, tap into the Journalists of Color and the LGBT journalist networks, because there are so many resources, there's so many strong and talented people to help talk about these issues, and just to have that open conversation about, what can we do better. But if you don't have diversity laden throughout your management structure, that is a major problem. And if people aren't being encouraged to have the conversation, if those people are not diverse, that's also a problem, because the issues that all of us up here experience, are just like everyone in the room, will intersect. Sometimes they will intersect and be congruent, and other times they will be very unique.
And we'll hear
we have
more
work to do.
And yeah, Loren, exactly.
Oh, I just wanted to say that I think the point about pathways is so important. I feel like one of the reasons why some of the stories we've heard in the last year of these men who, at these organizations, who have been allowed to get away with bad behavior for so long, part of it is because of this false belief that they are so talented that it's more important to keep them in the organization than to protect the women who are being harassed. And the reality is, sure, they're talented, but they're smart, they're talented, and society was built to nurture them. And so when we're thinking about pathways for women and people of color, we are not just beholden to these, like, this handful of white dudes who we think are the most talented people on earth and we can't lose. We have pipelines, and we have more people who we're nurturing actively because they're not getting that nurturing in the world to be these super talented rock stars.
We've kept Julie Moose waiting over here, so please.
Hi, Maxie Jackson, Executive Director of the Pacifica Foundation. What I'm going to have to say probably tailors more towards some of the latter comments that we've heard just recently. I want to encourage folks in the room to move away from addressing these issues, I would argue, from a reactionary or symptomological approach. I think we have to get to the root cause of why we're in this room. We keep mentioning people of color and women. That leaves out, I would argue, the real issue here, and that is white patriarchy or Western patriarchy and the constructs that evolve out of that. And I'm just wondering, when we're asking questions of our HR specialists, with our research folks, are we looking into what Western patriarchy brings forth and how it affects everybody in the space? And are we doing anything to deconstruct that, to destabilize it, to circumvent it, so that we can create a more unified space for everyone involved?
That's a wonderful jumping off point for the conversation we're going to have in the afternoon, too, about the depth of stories that we're going to be doing.
I mean, I would topple the patriarchy this afternoon. All right, I think what Loren was just getting at might be the most potent point. When you start talking about sexual harassment and mistreatment in the workplace, to me, it always comes back to something more profound, which is, do people, especially people who haven't been part of your legacy organization, feel like they have a place here? Do they feel like they have a path? And she put it more eloquently than I could, but that to me is the essence of why this matters. And who was the system set up to nurture, and who has been left to find their way? And all of that sort of intersects and collides with this bigger question of mistreatment and misconduct, in my view.
Yeah. Julie?
Hi, I'm Lena Wilson. I work in the newsroom at the New York Times. I've just been reflecting on the topic we're addressing today, which is what's changed and who's leading the way. And I think a major thing that's changed is who's leading the way. Not to be too much of a team player, but the Times published this huge comprehensive report of how many positions have been vacated by allegedly abusive men and how many of those positions have been filled by women. So being in a room with women who are occupying leadership positions in the newsroom, I'm curious how much you think that has changed your newsroom, if you think it's really impacted the culture. I think there can be a concern that it's a symbolic move. So I'd just like to hear more about that from you.
If I could just generally react really quickly, I don't think the change has been drastic enough or even subtle enough. The Power Shift Summit group, we had a discussion at NYU not too long ago, and we were talking about solutions and what should the solutions look like. And one of the things our subgroup talked about was, kind of just to your point, and generally industry-wide, like where is the change? We don't see the change. And for Fox News president, the new president announced last year, Susan Scott, we now know that CBS News has announced Susan Zorinsky. And as someone called me that evening and said, you know, God bless Susan Zorinsky, she's worked, 46 years, I think, at the network, and it took her 46 years to get there. And they said, Sarah, you know, I want you to tell all your friends and your colleagues, like, do something now, like work to make drastic change, because it shouldn't take a well-qualified person 46 years to get to that level of the network. And so to that point, you know, just far and wide to the industry and to all of us in here that are change makers, that we have to be committed, and we have to be committed to drastic change. It has to start at the top. And yes, I know I don't come from the HR side, but I'll push on the HR side that yes, everyone deserves consideration when jobs are open. But I really challenge people who are the hiring managers to ensure that you have a diverse pool and to ensure that there is change there. And I think that all of us, in this room and in the industry, have to put more pressure on our organizations to ask, where's the change? We can't just talk about the change. We can't just have training programs, but where actually is the change from the top down?
And in the 2 minutes that we have left,
I think it's I just found out, I would say that you make a great point. When I look around my newsroom, it is a work in progress. It is a work in progress. I've been at Politico since it launched 12 years ago. It is a vastly different place than it was 12 years ago. Just in the last year alone, or since I took over 2 years ago, we've increased diversity from about 14% to upwards of 22%, which has taken a lot of determined effort to do that, particularly in a politics newsroom. And I would have to say it is the big unmet challenge that I have ahead of me for the next 2 years, and one that it's representation and inclusivity, but representation at every level. And we do a really great job at bringing in younger people who come from very, very different backgrounds. And increasingly over the last year, having that diversity reflected throughout the layers of the newsroom. But it's one of these things that, if I look back 4 years ago, we were in just a vastly different place, just how we think about how we cover news. We saw it over the weekend with the CBS embed announcement where there was diversity, but there were no African-American reporters. Right. And I think this is the first election, I was saying this before this, where it is unacceptable to have any team, including at my own publication, that is not representative. And I'm saying in a very public forum, but it is the unmet challenge that we have as certainly as a politics newsroom, one that I am extraordinarily committed to meeting, in part because it just makes us better. And it addresses, and I think it's the root cause of all of this is that lack of representation. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And one that I just think will enrich us so greatly if we continue to embrace it as news leaders, because we don't have a choice.
Well, that's the perfect inflection point. They tell us that we're out of time for this session, but we have much more to talk about, and in particular, it's how we move forward. Mm-hmm. One thing that we've heard in sessions that we've been a part of, and Kathy Trost was at a big national discussion about the Me Too movement, and the question was, have we done a good enough job of telling the stories of people who aren't our co-workers, of the people who are making hotel beds, right? And the people who are working in the fire service and all of those other stories. And so after we hear from some experts about where we stand right now officially with data, then we're going to have our assignment desk. And that's really important because we're going to gather all of these great stories that have been done and hear from some of the great reporters who've done it, tips from them, and then ideas. So any of you in the room right now, if you've got an idea that, you don't have to be a journalist who's covered one, but if you've got an idea and you want to share it, put that out now. You'll be the greatest natural resource that we could ask for. So let's thank our conversation leaders and thank all of you.